Some signs are warnings, others are invitations, but the one nailed to a crooked pine tree halfway up the Selway Ridge looked like a dare. It said, "Turn back. The mountain keeps what you bring," written in uneven strokes, with the kind of red paint that looks too much like dried blood. Mike laughed when he saw it, just like he had laughed when mortars fell too close in Kandahar, and when his parachute once tangled at 40 feet. Because laughing is what he did when fear tried to flirt. He thought maybe some local kids were having fun with hikers, or that it was one of those stories small towns tell to keep people away. He took a picture of the sign with his phone and muttered, "Not today, mountain," before stepping over the broken fence and disappearing into the trees. Mike was 44, the kind of man who wore old boots even when new ones waited in the closet. The kind of man who never let anyone pump his gas, who still listened to cassette tapes because they felt heavier, more permanent. He had served 3 tours, built a quiet life afterward as a structural engineer, and found comfort in solitude. The forest was where he went to reset, where the noise of people and deadlines and his own haunted sleep couldn't follow. Idaho's wilderness, especially the ridges near Selway, was known for being vast and untouched, the kind of place maps hinted at, but never truly explained. The early October air had a bite to it, dry pine on the wind, and the ground cracked under his boots, with that satisfying crunch only those who love the woods understand. He had brought everything for a 4-day solo hunt. His rifle, a simple canvas tent, freeze-dried miles, a water filter, and an old survival knife passed down from his father, not because he needed it, but because it belonged out there. His pack was packed just right, his steps calculated, his route memorized, and his compass old-fashioned and trustworthy. He was not reckless, just confident, and that confidence had never been wrong before. The trail curved into dense brush, the elevation climbing gradually as the sun dipped behind the trees, and Mike moved like he always did in nature. Not as a visitor, but as someone returning to a place that owed him no welcome. He passed empty logging roads, stepped over fallen trunks, heard nothing but distant hawks and the occasional crack of small creatures bolting through leaves. No people, no voices, no sign of anything. Man-made, except for that one rotten fence and the warning nailed above it. And he'd already forgotten the sign. By the second day, the trail had thinned into something less sure, the kind of path that existed more in memory than on the ground, and Mike didn't mind. He liked when maps became useless, when instinct took over and the forest grew thicker around him, the pines taller, the air quieter. He moved through switchbacks and ridge lines barely marked by old boot prints and deer scat, and every once in a while he spotted something strange, like bark stripped too clean, or claw marks on trees too high for any black bear. And once a long streak of ash on a flat stone, no fire nearby, no campsite, just ash alone. He didn't pause, he just noted it like a hunter does, like a soldier does, filed it away and kept going. It wasn't until late afternoon that he noticed the prints. The ground was damp from last week's storm, and something had walked across it 5 toes wide, stride no claw drag, but too narrow to be human. They led downhill, then vanished mid-slope as if whatever left them had lifted into the air. Mike crouched near them, studying the edges pressed so crisp they couldn't be more than a few hours old. The wind kicked up then, and the trees rustled, not like leaves, but like fabric brushing against wood, and he felt the hairs rise along his forearms. Still, he didn't stop. He pushed forward through a notch in the ridge that narrowed like a throat, and the air beyond it felt heavier, like the barometric pressure dropped. But there were no clouds, no storm, just that weight pressing against his chest. The sun filtered through as a dull copper now, and shadows fell, strange directionless, sometimes stretching sideways, sometimes splitting into two. His compass needle began to twitch, nothing dramatic, just subtle movements that didn't align with north. He tapped it, then pocketed it, thinking maybe the mountains had a magnetic irregularity, but he had been here before, not this exact ridge, but close enough, and nothing had ever pulled like this. By the time he made camp near a stream that gurgled without rhythm, the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no bugs, no owls, and that silence wrapped around his tent like a second skin. He boiled water, ate quickly, and lay inside his sleeping bag, eyes open, staring at the nylon ceiling above him. And that's when he heard the breathing. It wasn't deep, it wasn't fast, it was steady, calm even, and it was coming from beneath him, through the earth, not next to the tent, not outside, but directly below the ground. It matched his breath beat for beat until he stopped breathing, and it stopped too. Mike didn't sleep that night. He lay perfectly still, listening to the breathing from beneath his tent, and long after it stopped, he kept his eyes open until morning, unsure whether he was awake or stuck, somewhere between thought and dream. When dawn finally broke, it didn't feel like dawn. The sky was gray, but it wasn't from clouds. The light itself seemed diluted, as if someone had turned down the color of the world. He packed up quickly without eating his body, moving out of habit rather than hunger, and began heading back the way he had come, but nothing looked familiar. The notched ridge was gone, replaced by a slope he didn't remember, and the stream now curved in the opposite direction. It was then that he noticed the trees. The same 5 trees appeared again in identical arrangement. A tall pine split at the base, a stump with a circle of stones around it, a fallen log with bark missing on one side. They had been behind his camp the night before, now they were ahead of him. He walked anyway, checked his compass again. The needle spun briefly, then rested on a direction that felt wrong. But he followed it because that was all he had. The silence was heavier now, not just quiet, but total absence. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, the forest swallowing the crunch of boots and the whisper of brush. The air grew colder despite the rising sun, and his breath came out in short, visible bursts that didn't drift, but clung to his face. Time stretched. The sun didn't move, or maybe it did, in a way he couldn't track, and eventually he began to talk out loud to himself, not for comfort, but to keep time to anchor himself. But then the forest began to answer, not with new sounds, but with his own voice, repeated seconds later, always slightly off, slightly warped like a bad recording played back from deep in the trees. When he shouted for help, the echo didn't come right away, and when it did, it came from behind him, not ahead. He ran not in panic, but in protest, as if running would reassert control, and the forest let him run. Didn't stop him, didn't change, just let him go in circles, until he returned to a clearing he swore he had never seen, but in the middle of it was his own boot print, unmistakable, worn at the heel, just like his left foot always did. He sat down and took off his pack, checked his water, checked his knife. Both still there, both useless, and when he looked up, the sun was gone again. Not set, not hidden, just gone, and the gray returned thicker this time as if the sky itself had collapsed into fog. Then came the voices, not words, not language, just sound, shaped like memory. His mother calling him from a kitchen window, his drill sergeant barking over rifle fire, his own voice saying no, 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 in that desperate tone he hadn't heard since the day he watched a friend bleed out. He pressed his hands over his ears and the voices grew louder, not as sound but as pressure, like they were trying to get in through the bone. He stumbled forward through the fog until he saw it. the cabin squatting low at the base of a cluster of stone pines, a place that did not belong, that had no right to be there. It was old, but not decayed. Wood darkened not with rot, but with age, smooth and seamless. No windows, just a single door. He hesitated, hand on the handle, and for the first time since stepping into the woods, Mike felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The purest form of dread, not fear of injury, not fear of pain, but the absolute certainty that if he opened that door, something about him would be changed forever. Mike opened the door, not because he wanted to, but because his hand turned the knob before his mind could argue against it. The air inside was warm, like the inside of a mouth, and it smelled of cedar and iron. The door closed behind him soundlessly, and he stood in a space that had no corners, no windows, and no visible light. Yet he could see everything. The walls pulsed slightly like they were breathing, and the floor beneath his boots felt soft like old carpet, though there was none. He walked forward, and with each step the room adjusted not physically, but perceptually, as if the space recognized his thoughts and changed its shape to reflect them. He reached out to touch the wall, and it wasn't wood. It was smooth and warm, like polished bone, and it vibrated faintly beneath his palm. He whispered hello, and the word echoed back, but slower, deeper, and from all directions. The sound wasn't a reflection, it was a reply, and it used his voice, but it wasn't him. He turned quickly and found nothing but more wall, more seamless curve, more silence. He spoke again this time, asking, "Where am I?" And the answer came again from the room, but it wasn't words. Just emotion, thick and ancient, like shame and recognition, and something that might have been hunger. He backed away and stumbled over nothing, landing hard on the floor, but it caught him gently, like falling into breath. And that was when the wall across from him opened, not physically, but perceptually. It simply was no longer there, and beyond it stood himself, but older eyes, sunken shoulders, bent hands shaken with a cup of coffee he had not held in years. The room wasn't showing memories, it was projecting regret like a mirror built of what should have been. The older version of him looked up and smiled the way his father had smiled the day he left for basic training, and then that version melted. Not like wax, but like shadow reabsorbed into the wall as if it had only borrowed shape. Mike stood again, his breath shallow. He tried to leave, but the door was gone. Not closed, not hidden, but simply never existed. The room had no entrance now, only walls that watched and echoed and breathed. He yelled, not in rage, but in defiance, hoping to break the logic of the place. But the sound came back sharper as if filtered through grief, and it pierced his chest like a memory he couldn't escape. The space began to contract, not with pressure, but with intimacy. It knew him. It reached into him without touch, and began showing more moments not in vision but in sensation. The time he didn't answer the phone, the night his brother died. The words he never said to his wife, before she left, the hollow moments that never left, but always lingered just behind the noise of daily life. They came forward now, not as punishment, but as truth. The mountain doesn't kill it, remembers it keeps what you bring. And Mike had brought everything he thought he had buried under discipline, under silence, under years of pretending he had moved on. The room vibrated now with rhythm like a heartbeat, and he realized it matched his own. He tried to steady it, to control his breath, and the rhythm slowed, but only slightly, because it no longer belonged entirely to him. The room was keeping time now, and he was no longer certain where his edges ended and where it began. He stepped forward and felt the floor give slightly, like stepping into thick water, and then he saw them, not versions of himself, but echoes of others. Men and women, boys and girls, Some recent, some ancient, their forms flickered in and out of visibility like thoughts remembered too quickly to be seen fully. They did not speak. They only watched him. Watched with eyes that had seen the same wall, the same pulsing, the same truths, and none of them moved as if trapped in understanding, not by force, but by choice. He wanted to ask them why they had stayed, what they had seen, but the words wouldn't form. His mouth moved, but only fog came out. The room was learning him, unspooling his essence and cataloging it like a memory, folding itself around a name he didn't know anymore. He dropped to his knees, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of being known fully entirely, without mask or story or excuse, and in that moment a part of him welcomed it. The silence, the stillness, the absence of pretending that he was ever in control, that he was ever alone, that he was ever whole. The room didn't judge, it reflected, and in doing so, it erased the line between observer and observed. Mike closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was sitting on the forest floor outside the cabin. Except there was no cabin, and the sky was bright, and the birds were chirping again, as if nothing had happened. His pack was beside him, untouched as compass, pointed true north. His water bottle was full and cold, and he stood slowly looking around, breathing once, twice, 3 times, but nothing answered. No echo, no voice, no shadow, just sunlight and pine and the sound of something very old no longer paying attention to him. Mike didn't move. At first, he just stood there letting the moment pass through him, not sure if what he experienced had been real or hallucination or some ancient part of the forest communicating in a language older than memory. He checked his gear again. Everything was in place, and yet nothing felt the same. The forest around him looked familiar, but now held a sense of watching, as though the trees had witnessed what had happened and chosen to say nothing. He began walking slowly, placing each foot with care, not out of fear of traps or wild animals, but out of reverence, like stepping through sacred ground. The trail returned, eventually faint at first, then more sure, and as he walked, the rhythm of nature began to return. Birds sang again, insects buzzed, the wind moved through the canopy in waves, and for a moment he let himself believe he had made it through, that whatever he had faced in that cabin, whatever had been revealed to him, was now behind him. But the truth was, it wasn't behind him, it was inside him. Every regret that room had shown him, every moment he had avoided, every silence he had buried, it had all stayed. The cabin hadn't changed him. It had stripped him down, peeled away the image he had spent years building, and now he walked not as a man free of fear, but as a man who understood it, who had made peace with the fact that some choices never stop echoing. That night, he didn't set up a tent. He simply lay under the stars, staring up into a sky that no longer felt like it belonged to the same world. He thought of his brother, of the last message he never returned, of how sometimes we ignore the signs, not because we don't see them, but because we're afraid of what they might mean. He had been afraid to stop moving, afraid to sit with his own thoughts long enough to hear what they were actually saying. The forest had made him sit. It had made him listen. And now, miles from the cabin, he realized the most terrifying thing it had shown him wasn't a ghost or a vision. It was the truth of his own reflection. How easy it is to become a version of yourself that even you don't recognize. At sunrise, he reached the edge of the forest. His car was still parked where he left it, a layer of dust on the windshield, as if the world had kept spinning in his absence. He stood by the driver's side door for a long time, looking at the reflection in the window. The man staring back looked the same, but something in the eyes had shifted. He drove in silence, radio off, windows down, letting the air wash through the vehicle, through his chest, through the spaces the mountain had opened inside him. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove to his parents' place, left a note on the porch, not because they had asked for one, but because he wanted to say something simple, something real. Then he drove to the town where his brother had lived, stood outside the house that now belonged to someone else, whispered, "I'm sorry," without expecting anything back. On the way home, he stopped at the edge of a lake, the same one he had avoided for years, and stood by the water, remembering the friend who had drowned there, the joke that went too far, the rope that wasn't checked, the current that pulled too fast. He had blamed the river, then time, then fate, but the truth was, he had seen the signs then too, and he had ignored them, because laughter is louder than caution, and youth drowns warnings. He sat by the water for hours, not to punish himself, but to acknowledge that some truths don't need to be healed, only held. The cost of ignoring the signs had never been about ghosts or monsters. It had been about becoming someone you didn't mean to become, and staying that way, simply because change required you to admit what went wrong. As night fell again and the stars returned, Mike looked up and smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because now, finally, he knew how to start. The forest had not broken him. It had unhidden him. And for the first time in years, he was listening.